The torches cast long shadows across the marble floor as she walked barefoot toward the wooden figure in the corner. Her hands were shaking. Behind her, 7 witnesses stood in silence, their faces illuminated by lamplight, their eyes following her every movement. She had been told this was tradition, that every bride before her had done the same, that resisting would bring shame upon her family. But no one had explained what the tradition actually required. Not until this moment. Not until the cloth was pulled away and she saw what waited beneath. The year was 89 CE, in the reign of Emperor Domitian and 18-year-old Flavia. Tirsa was about to discover that Roman marriage was nothing like the saffron veils and scattered walnuts of the public ceremony. What happened behind closed doors, in the presence of witnesses who would later testify in court if needed, was something else entirely, something Rome's own historians would later struggle to describe, something the Christian Church would spend centuries trying to erase from memory. Before we go any deeper into this story, I'm genuinely curious where you're listening from right now. It amazes me how a ritual from 2,000 years ago can reach people across every continent today. Drop a comment and let me know. The wedding procession had been beautiful in its way. Flavia had worn the traditional flame-cold veil that marked her as a bride, her hair arranged in 6 braids bound with wool ribbons exactly as custom prescribed. The sacrifice at the temple had gone smoothly, the sheep centrils showing favorable omens. Her father had signed the contracts that transferred her from his legal authority to her husband's, using the ancient formula that made the union binding under Roman law. She had spoken the ritual words that generations of brides had spoken. Eubatu, Gasaz, Ego Ga, where you are Gasai, I am Gaia. The phrase meant she was no longer herself. She belonged to her husband now, to Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years, her senior, whom she had met exactly 3 times before this day. But that ceremony was merely the legal beginning. What waited at the end of the torch-lit procession through Rome's streets in the house she had never entered? In the room where witnesses were already assembled, that was where the true transformation would occur. That was where she would learn what Roman law actually required of a wife's body. The crowds surrounding the procession had sung obscene songs as tradition demanded. The Ficini verses were explicit and crude, describing in graphic detail what would happen to her at night. Young men in the crowd shouted suggestions that made her face burn beneath the veil. Her mother had told her this was meant to drive away evil spirits through the power of laughter and embarrassment. But Flavia noticed her mother was not laughing. Her mother had wept while arranging her hair that morning, and her final words had been whispered like a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they require, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. They reached the house of Marcus Petronius Rufus as the sun disappeared completely. The doorway was decorated with wool and greenery, 2 torches marking this as a place where a marriage would be consummated according to law. The crowd grew louder, the songs more explicit. Someone threw walnuts at her, the shells catching in the folds of her dress, a fertility blessing that felt more like mockery. Her husband stood waiting in the doorway, and behind him she could see figures moving in the lamplight. Too many figures, far too many for a private moment between bride and groom. Marcus lifted her over the threshold because tradition said it was unlucky for a bride to stumble entering her new home, and because the gesture symbolized something older, something from an era when women were carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wished to enter or not. The door closed behind her, muffling the singing outside, and Flavia finally saw what was waiting in the atrium. An elderly woman in formal robes, a pronuba whose role was to oversee everything that would happen tonight, a priest of uncertain affiliation, 3 female slaves carrying basins and claws, an older man with a leather bag of medical instruments resting at his feet, and in the corner, draped in fabric that concealed its exact shape, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The pronuber stepped forward and took Flavia's hands in a grip that was firm, almost restraining, as though she expected Flavia to try to flee. Welcome to your husband's home, the pronuba said. The sacred rites must now be completed. Here is what almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It was not primarily a romantic union. It was a property transfer documented and witnessed like the sale of a farm or a ship. Roman law classified marriage as conventio and maenum. literally coming into the hand, which meant a woman passed from her father's ownership to her husband's. Before the late Republic, this transfer was absolute. A husband held the same legal power over his wife that he held over his slaves, including, theoretically, the right of life and death. By the imperial period, when Flavia walked that torchlit path, the law had softened somewhat. Women could own property. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances, but the fundamental principle remained. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's authority to another's. And like all significant property transfers in Rome, it required verification. Consider how Romans handled the sale of land. Witnesses observed the transaction. The property was inspected to confirm it matched the seller's description. Rituals invoked divine blessing on the transfer. Boundaries were walked, documents were sealed, and everyone involved understood exactly what was being exchanged. The Romans applied this same logic to marriage with one crucial addition. The bride's primary value lay in her capacity to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the resource being purchased. And Roman law required that both be verified before the transaction could be considered complete. This was not interpretation. Roman legal texts state explicitly that a marriage was not valid until consummated. The consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses because otherwise how could anyone be certain it had occurred? The bride's virginity had to be verified because otherwise how could the husband be certain that any children she bore were his? Each of these requirements generated corresponding rituals. Rituals that made perfect sense within Roman legal logic. Rituals that horrify modern sensibilities precisely because that. Logic is so alien to how we understand marriage today. The Pronuba guided Flavia toward the draped figure in the corner. Flavia's heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. The Pronuba's hand remained on her arm, firm and guiding, allowing no retreat. "You must greet mutinous Tutinus," the Prenubis said. "You must ask his blessing before your husband approaches. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia reached out with trembling hands and pulled back the cloth. What stood beneath was a wooden figure carved with anatomical precision into the shape of a phallus. But this was not a small amulet, like the ones that hung around children's necks to ward off evil. This was not a garden scarecrow meant to frighten intruders. This figure was sized deliberately, proportioned carefully for a specific purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the Pronuba began explaining what Flavia must do. The god Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's deity of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because multiple ancient sources mention him always briefly, always with visible discomfort. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was conquering pagan Rome, described the practice with outrage. Roman brides were required to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutinus as a sacred duty before consummation with their husbands. The ritual was performed in the presence of witnesses. Augustine was a hostile source writing to condemn paganism. But his description matches fragments from merelier non-Christian texts that refer to the same practice. Lactutius, another church father, called it so shameful that even naming it pollutes the speaker. Arnobius provided the most detailed account describing brides made to straddle the god's emblem, their new husbands looking on. The clear's throat. Antiquarian. Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian agenda, mentioned Mutinus Tutinus as a deity to whom brides were presented using language that implied physical contact without explicitly describing it. Modern historians who address this ritual at all tend to minimize it, suggesting the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic gesture. But the language of ancient sources does not support this comfortable interpretation. Augustinian's word was insidier, which means to settle onto or mount. Arnabius used language implying penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the details because they were too shameful, which seems an excessive reaction to someone briefly touching a statue. The stated purpose was to seek divine blessing for fertility. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously acknowledged, was preparation. It was breaking down resistance before the real consummation occurred. It was demonstrating absolute submission before witnesses. It was conditioning a virgin bride to accept what would follow. Flavia stood before the figure. The Pronuba positioned her, guided her body, instructed her in what was required. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited to perform his examination afterward. And Flavia understood finally what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been preparing her for, what being a Roman wife actually required. She could have refused theoretically, but refusal meant disgrace for her family. Nullification of the contracts, return to her father's house as damaged goods no respectable man would marry. It meant everything she had been taught about duty and honor would be proven false, and she would be proven worthless. She did not refuse. After the ritual with the statue, slaves washed her in the basin of scented water. This washing had religious significance, purifying her after the encounter with the god. But it was also practical preparation for what came next, the medical examination. The physician, who had been standing silent throughout, now approached. This examination was not optional. Before any wedding involving significant property, a respectable Roman bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virginal status. The examination was documented, and the documentation became part of the legal record establishing the bride's value. Roman medical texts describe the techniques used with clinical precision that leaves no ambiguity about what was involved. This pre-wedding examination established a baseline. The bride was confirmed as intact as never having belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with Mutanius Teutonus, the physician performed a second examination. This verified that the ritual had been properly completed, that their physical state was consistent with what the earlier examination had established, that she was prepared for consummation with her husband. All of this occurred in the presence of witnesses whose testimony might be required. If any aspect of the marriage was ever legally challenged, what strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions is not just their invasiveness, but their casualness. The Romans did not view these rituals as traumatic or problematic. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented were no more relevant in the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property does not have feelings. Property is transferred according to proper procedures. After the examination, Flavia was led to the bedchamber that had been prepared for consummation. The room had been decorated according to tradition with the marriage. Bed positioned for optimal visibility from the doorway which would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided sufficient light for the pianuba to observe from her position near the entrance. The slaves who would be needed afterward stood ready in the corridor. Marcus entered. He seemed nervous, which surprised Flavia. She had assumed he would be confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something like embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronuba spoke, her voice formal and ritualistic. The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Clear's throat greater than, let no one question that this woman has become a wife. What followed took several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally providing instruction when necessary, ensuring the consummation was completed in ways that would satisfy legal requirements. The door remained open. Psalms carried into the corridor where slaves waited. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to ensure that no aspect of the property transfer could later be disputed. At dorm, the physician returned for a final examination. This confirmed that consummation had occurred, that the bride was now physically changed in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided formal testimony regarding what she had witnessed. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. She would bear 4 children over the next decade. She would manage her husband's household competently. She would attend festivals and fulfill all duties expected of a matron of her status, and she would never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged, because what was there to say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they witnessed. The rituals were so embedded in Roman life that describing them seemed unnecessary, like describing how one breathes. Everyone knew, no one spoke of it. This is why reconstructing these practices requires piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical texts, and archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you understand what it was designed for. The silence was not conspiracy. It was simply how deeply embedded these practices were. They were the water Roman women swam in, so omnipresent that describing them seemed pointless. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to their daughters in whispers that prepared the next generation. The system perpetuated itself because everyone involved accepted its fundamental premises. Property must be verified. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end came not from internal Roman reform, but from external religious conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought fundamentally different premises. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property, requiring examination. If marriage was a sacred mystery, it could not include elements the church considered obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive. The transition took centuries and was never entirely complete. But in cities and among educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed, and the suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of mutinous tuttiness were smashed or buried. Texts describing night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The pranuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually involved was lost to everyone, except scholars studying fragmentary surviving sources. The Christians who transformed Rome were not simply erasing embarrassing history. They were trying to build a new civilization on Roman foundations, widening what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded so well that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Flavia died in the year 131 CE at approximately age 60. She had been a wife for over 40 years. What did she think about her wedding night in all those decades that followed? Did she remember it as trauma, as acceptance, a something between? Did she wish something different for her daughters? Or did she accept that this was simply how things were? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence that surrounds these practices is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies were not considered relevant to the histories and legal texts that men produced. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they thought about what was done, but we know enough to understand why this history was erased. It revealed something uncomfortable about the civilization we have inherited. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law and culture. Acknowledging what Rome actually did to its women complicates that inheritance. It suggests that civilization and brutality can coexist, that legal sophistication can exist alongside systematic dehumanization. Clear's throat, greater than the wedding night rituals of Rome, are gone, but the women who experienced them were real. For Flavia Teresa, for her mother, for her daughters, for all the generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were rituals of verification and control, they lived. They endured. They were silenced. They were silenced.